The French Revolution had begun as a movement for freedom, a rebellion against tyranny, a call for justice. The monarchy had fallen, the king and queen had been executed, and the streets of Paris had celebrated their victory over oppression. But the people had not found peace. Instead of stability, the revolution unleashed something far worse, an uncontrollable hunger for blood. In 1792, France was still in chaos. The revolutionaries were paranoid, convinced that enemies lurked everywhere. Foreign armies threatened invasion, and within the city, suspected traitors were being exposed daily. A question hung over Paris like a shadow. What if the monarchy's supporters were still alive? What if they were plotting in secret, waiting for the right moment to strike back? This fear spread like an infection, growing stronger with every whisper, every rumor, every unfounded suspicion. And when the people of Paris could no longer tell who their true enemies were, they turned on everyone. The revolution had devoured the monarchy. Now, it would devour itself. By the summer of 1792, France was on the brink of collapse. The revolutionary government, the National Convention, had taken power, but it was weak, fragile, and deeply divided. Meanwhile, France was at war with Austria and Prussia, who had declared their intention to restore the monarchy and crush the revolution. The city of Paris was in a state of panic. As foreign troops advanced toward France's borders, the revolutionaries began to fear that their greatest danger was not outside the country, but within. There were still thousands of people in Parisian prisons, royalist sympathizers, nobles, clergymen, and suspected counter-revolutionaries. The revolutionaries believed that if Prussia and Austria invaded, these prisoners would rise up, join the enemy, and slaughter the people of Paris from within. The paranoia reached its peak when news arrived that the fortress of Verdun had fallen to the Prussians. This meant that enemy troops were marching toward Paris, and at any moment, the capital could be invaded. With fear and rage gripping the city, the people of Paris came to one terrifying conclusion. They could not risk leaving prisoners alive. The revolutionaries did not wait for a trial. They did not wait for orders. They took justice into their own hands. And over the next 5 days, they would turn Paris into a slaughterhouse. On September 2nd, 1792, a mob of revolutionaries stormed the prisons of Paris. What began as an act of defense against imaginary traitors quickly descended into a mass execution. The first to die were the priests. In the Abbaye prison, more than 200 priests were dragged from their cells and into the courtyard. The revolutionaries claimed they were conspirators, plotting to overthrow the Republic. One by one, they were lined up and slaughtered. Some were hacked apart with swords, others were bludgeoned to death with clubs. Those who tried to plead for mercy were met with laughter and jeers. The massacre spread like wildfire. In the La Force prison, women and children were among the victims. The Princesse de Lamballe, a close friend of Marie Antoinette, was dragged before a crowd of revolutionaries. She was given a choice: swear loyalty to the revolution or die. She refused. What happened next was one of the most infamous acts of violence of the entire revolution. She was beaten, stripped naked, and hacked apart with swords. Her severed head was mounted on a pike and paraded through the streets. Some accounts claim that her heart was cut out and eaten by one of the revolutionaries, though this remains disputed. The killing continued for 5 days. In the Conciergerie prison, nobles and royalists were thrown into the streets, where waiting crowds tore them apart with their bare hands. Some were tied together and executed en masse. By the time the bloodshed ended, nearly 1,400 people had been slaughtered. The prisons, once filled with prisoners, now reeked of death. The streets ran red with blood, and the revolution had crossed a terrifying threshold. The people of Paris had become executioners, but they were not yet satisfied. The guillotine had been built to replace the barbaric, chaotic executions of the past. It was supposed to be swift, efficient, and humane. But now, the guillotine became something else entirely. It became entertainment. The September Massacres shocked even some of the revolution's most radical leaders, but to the people of Paris, this was justice. How did ordinary men and women, many of whom had once been farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, become executioners overnight? Part of the answer lies in the power of the mob. When a person stands alone, they hesitate, but when surrounded by hundreds of screaming revolutionaries, that hesitation disappears. The frenzy of the crowd takes over, and individuals become consumed by the collective will. Propaganda also played a role. Revolutionary newspapers spread wild rumors about imprisoned nobles planning massacres against the people. These stories fueled the paranoia, making violence seem like a necessary act of self-defense. Finally, there was the thrill of power. The people of France had lived under the rule of kings for centuries. They had spent their lives as subjects, following orders, bowing before their rulers. Now, for the first time, they were the ones in control. The executions were not just punishment, they were an assertion of dominance. The revolutionaries believed they were not just killing individuals, but killing an entire system of oppression. And soon, the guillotine would make that process even easier. Paris had been drenched in blood by angry mobs, but now, the revolution would become more organized, more efficient, and even more terrifying. The guillotine would become a machine of mass death, and the people of Paris would gather to watch, to cheer, and to turn public executions into a national obsession. The September Massacres had proven one thing: Paris had an insatiable thirst for blood. Fear had turned to paranoia. Paranoia had turned to murder. And now, murder had turned into entertainment. The guillotine, once introduced as a humane alternative to brutal executions, now became the centerpiece of a national spectacle. Crowds no longer watched in horror. They cheered, they laughed, they celebrated. The execution site in the Place de la Révolution became theatre, and the daily beheadings were treated as performances. Some Parisians arrived early to claim the best spots, much like they would at the opera. They brought food and drink, turning the executions into picnics, where they could eat fresh bread and sip wine while heads rolled before them. The women of Paris, known as the tricoteuses, sat at the front, knitting as they watched the condemned die. Their needles clicked methodically, matching the rhythm of the falling blade. Some whispered among themselves, placing bets on how long a victim would struggle before their body stopped twitching. Children were brought to the scaffold to witness the executions as a lesson in justice. Some revolutionaries believed that watching the death of traitors would harden the next generation, a new France built on the corpses of the old regime. The executioners became celebrities. The most famous among them was Charles-Henri Sanson, the royal executioner turned servant of the revolution. He had once executed criminals in secret, but now his work was on display for all of Paris to see. His precision with the guillotine was admired, and he became a household name. Some even requested to shake his hand, believing it gave them good luck. But no execution drew more crowds than the deaths of former nobles, priests, and revolutionaries turned traitors. The people gathered in the thousands to see the famous fall under the blade. And one of the most shocking executions was yet to come. The revolution claimed many lives, but it would soon turn against one of its own, a woman who had fought for justice but dared to fight for women's rights. Her name was Olympe de Gouges, and for her, the guillotine was waiting. Olympe de Gouges had once believed in the revolution. She had written plays, pamphlets, and essays in support of liberty, fighting against the oppression of the monarchy. But unlike many revolutionaries, she did not believe that freedom should be reserved for men. She argued that women deserved the same rights as men. She wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, a direct response to the revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man. In it, she boldly stated, "Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights." She called for women to have a voice in politics, the right to vote, and the right to divorce abusive husbands. She also opposed the execution of Louis XVI, believing that a just society should not be built on vengeance. But the revolution did not want her ideas. The leaders of the National Convention saw her feminism as dangerous, and her opposition to violence as a betrayal. In 1793, she was arrested and charged with sedition. Her trial was a farce. She was denied legal representation, mocked in court, and sentenced to death. The revolution, which had once fought against the silencing of voices, now silenced one of its own. On November 3rd, 1793, Olympe de Gouges was led to the guillotine. As she climbed the scaffold, she turned to the crowd and shouted her final words. "Children of the fatherland, you will avenge my death." The blade fell, her head was lifted into the air, and the revolution had executed one of its most brilliant minds, one of the few who had dared to fight for justice without bloodshed. But even as the guillotine continued to claim victims, the revolution was already beginning to crumble. Its leaders were turning against each other. The executions were no longer enough. The people were hungry for more. And soon, France would see even greater horrors, drownings, mass executions, and even rumors of cannibalism. The revolution had lost its way, and the bloodbath was far from over. The streets of Paris were drenched in red. The September Massacres had proven that the people were willing to kill without hesitation. The guillotine had transformed from a tool of justice into a machine of mass murder. And yet, the revolutionaries had not stopped. Anyone suspected of betraying the revolution was executed without trial. Nobles, priests, former revolutionaries, women, and even children were led to the scaffold. By the end of 1793, nearly 17,000 people had been executed. The blood had once been reserved for kings and queens. Now it belonged to everyone. The reign of terror had begun, and no one would be spared. What had started as a fight for justice had become an endless cycle of death. The revolutionaries had killed the king, the queen, the nobles, and the priests. But soon, they would kill their own leaders, their own friends, and even their own children. In the final part of this saga, we will explore the darkest days of the revolution. We will uncover the cannibal butcher of Paris, the national baths of the Loire, and the executions of the very men who built the reign of terror.